I got contacted by one of my regular clients who's finished her PhD, and she sent me a message saying, "This is going to be a bit meta, Vicky, but how would you recommend that people listen to your podcast?" Because she likes to listen while she's doing craft or something like that, because she finds that if she's just listening, then she ends up picking up her phone, looking at other things at the same time. Not offended, Sophie. I get it. I get a bit like that with podcasts too. I'm not very good at just sitting listening either. But then she finds that she doesn't make notes and she feels like she's not necessarily getting maximum use out of the podcast. And so she asked whether I had any tips about how to listen to a podcast. Now, there's many different ways you can do this, but I'm going to give you some tips that I have found useful for me. I have a bunch of podcasts that I listen to regularly, and I think there's a few things that are useful here. The first is, don't overthink this. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. I have some podcasts that I listen to because I find them broadly interesting, broadly motivational, and I always end up feeling like I want to get on with things afterwards. Does that mean I implement the exact things they talk about? Often, no. Often it's just like, oh, that's an interesting idea, but I don't actually do it. But there's something about hearing them talk it through that just puts me in a frame of mind that I like. And for many of you listening to this podcast, that might be it. Maybe you just like listening to me wittering away, sounding vaguely motivational, making you feel like you can actually do your PhD. Perfect. If that works for you, that's enough. Do your crafts, walk your dog, listen to me while you're driving, whatever it is. And don't worry too much that you're not implementing everything that I say if you're still getting benefit from just listening to me witter. Okay? Don't overthink it. However, if on occasions you're like, you know what, there are some of these things that I actually want to try out. I don't want to just be consuming these ideas anymore. I want to actually make sure that I'm trying them and practicing them in my life. And to be honest, if you want to change your behavior, that's a really sensible thing. Then the first thing to say is, let's get specific with that. Let's not try and implement everything I talk about in every single episode. I don't implement everything I talk about. I try to, but all at the same time is too much for my little brain. I can't implement everything all at once. You definitely can't. So if you're kind of going, I find Vicky's podcast really useful, but I feel like I want to move to the stage where I implement things, let's just pick one episode. What is the biggest pain point in your life at the moment? What's the one thing that if you could make some progress on that, it would really help? Then go to my website, thephdlifecoach.com, and go to podcast, and you'll find all of my episodes there. I am soon going to have some better kind of tagging system, but at the moment you can just scroll on through, find an episode that answers that pinch point. And side note, if you notice that there's no episode that answers your problem, let me know. I want to record that episode. I want it to feel like when you go there, there is everything you need to succeed in your PhDs in academia. So have a look, find one, and then you've got 3 different choices of how you consume it. There's video, if that helps, on YouTube. There's the podcast version, and there's a full transcript on my website. So if you are somebody who is better when you're wanting to implement things, better off just reading it, it's right there for you. Word for word transcript of everything I say in the podcast. So just pick one episode, go to the website, consume it in the way that you find best, and then pick one thing from it that you want to do. If this is something you want more support with, make sure you're on my newsletter. I know my client already is on my newsletter, for any of you who aren't. If you're on my newsletter, you get a little summary of the podcast. So you get 3 take-home messages. You get 2 reflective questions to try out that are connected to that topic. And you get 1 specific action to take. So if you're a bit like, I want to implement from this episode, but even looking at the transcript feels a bit overwhelming, make sure in your newsletter you will get those week by week. Now, secret for you. I am currently looking at a way to create a repository of all those newsletters and to go back and create them for old episodes so that we end up with like a summary bank of all of those things. It hasn't happened yet. It's the middle of November right now. Who knows? Well, it will exist by the time you listen to this. If you listen to it live, it does not. But it is on my agenda. So keep an eye out for that because I think it would be super useful. My final thing connects back to an episode from a few weeks ago where I talked about using voice notes to kind of capture your ideas. And I tried this one out the other day and it was amazing. A little bit disjointed, but amazing. So I like to listen to podcasts while I walk because I'm similar to Sophie. I'm not very good at just sitting still and reading these things. But there are sometimes not necessarily even things that they say that I want to implement, but that while I'm listening to them, it made me think of something. And so what I did the other day, I was listening to a book because I have an author coming up on a future podcast. He's going to come out in January, I think it is. I recorded it last night. He's amazing. You're going to love it. But I was finishing out listening to his book, and it was making me think of loads of things that I wanted to ask him and talk about. And so what I was doing was I was walking around my village with my headphones in, listening to my book, March, March, March. And whenever I had something that I wanted to remember, I paused my podcast, I opened my Otter AI, I whittled into my phone for a minute, stop, go back to the podcast. It's actually quite similar to how my husband and I listen to podcasts in the car. We'll listen for like 3 minutes and then one of us will pause it and we'll talk about something and then we'll go again and then somebody else will get another idea and we'll press pause. And for anybody else, quite annoying. We love it. So that's another way that you can do it, is either having a notebook with you or using voice notes on your phone, so that as you're listening, even if you're doing crafts or you're walking or whatever, you can just pause and add notes into that. Obviously, it doesn't work so well while you're driving, but hopefully having the transcript and the notes from the newsletter will enable you to return to the things that you want to return to. On that, if you find this podcast useful, I have one request, one teeny tiny request for you. Send it to somebody. Find an episode that you think is particularly useful to something that one of your friends has told you they're stressed about, and send it to them. Send them and say, I love this podcast. This will really help you. Listen to it now. Call me when you've done it. We'll have a chat about it. Make sure you listen. Or suggest it for one of your university like journal clubs or something like that. Suggest everyone listen to this episode and then we'll talk about how we can implement it and how it could change the way we do things. Please, please, please share this. When people listen to the podcast, they tell me so many nice things about it. And I just want to make sure it's getting to all the people that could benefit.